mongoose DNA and magically infused streetcar crashes. Superheroes are the work of science fiction, and sometimes the ways they get their powers can be just a tiny little bit wacky. In this video, we're gonna look at some of the more out there ones. And there's no better place to start than with Spiderwoman. Born in 1924, a little tiny Jessica Drew traveled with her parents Jonathan and Miriam to Mount Wondergore. There, her father Jonathan conducted genetics research with one Dr. Herbert Wyndham, who would later go on to become the incredibly powerful High Evolutionary. At 7 years old, Jessica contracted uranium poisoning from her father's work, but Jonathan and Wyndham managed to actually save her life using a spider-derived serum and combining it with years and years of hibernation in a genetic accelerator. Jessica then spent decades in stasis, receiving subliminal education via special tapes, kind of like how baby Superman was instilled with his values and all that jazz when traveling through space to Earth. When she finally awakened, she was cured and had only aged up to her early teens. She also discovered that she now possessed superhuman powers as a result of the combination of the radiation exposure and the spider serum. But then, later, it was said that her actual origin was because of a failed experiment that exposed Jessica's pregnant mom to radiation, which managed to give Jessica spider powers when she was born. Either way, when she first showed up in comic books in Marvel Spotlight number 32, she had become an agent of Hydra and was sent on a mission to try and wipe out the director of S.H.I.E.L.D., Nick Fury. Luckily, he brought her to the light side. But moving on from Spider-Woman to something completely insane, Bob Frank and his father Emile were traveling through Africa when they both unfortunately came down with an extremely deadly illness. Needing a transfusion in order to save their lives, Emile made it a mission to find someone who would be willing to help them and to save Bob's life. Apparently, there was absolutely no one who could help them out. But then, to make matters so much worse, Bob also got bitten by a very deadly cobra. Bob was not having a good time. When that happened, a mongoose then just showed up and it introduced that snake to the afterlife. Of course, this must have been a sign, and Emile had the idea to use this mongoose for the transfusion instead of a regular human being to save his son's life. Not only did the mongoose DNA running through his veins somehow actually save his life, but naturally, this had the added benefit of allowing Bob to now run at super speed. Apparently, this was just common information, as Emile explained it as nonchalantly as pouring a cup of tea. Later on, it would be revealed that Frank had natural powers that were just jump-started by the addition of the mongoose DNA, but of course, that's only after they realized how that makes no sense. But moving on from that, a young Richard Grey, who would go on to become the flying superhero known as Black Condor, was the only survivor of an attack by Mongolian bandits on him and his archaeologist family. Now, stuck alone and in the wild, the little Richard was taken in by a family in the same kind of way that Mowgli was taken in by wolves and Tarzan was taken in by gorillas. Unfortunately, Richard was not a bird though. He didn't have the musculature or the feathers or anything really that allowed him to take flight like his new family could. But what are millions of years of evolution compared to the human brain and a little bit of practice? Richard spent most of his life studying the birds until he actually managed to just teach himself how to fly. Oh, there was also the exposure to a radioactive meteor that may have had something to do with it, but he truly believed that he had taught himself to fly. Once he was discovered by a missionary, Grey headed back home to the United States, where he became the flying adventurer known as the Black Condor. He went back specifically to save a certain US senator, but when he was actually too late, he just happened to look exactly like the senator, so he decided to abandon the name of Richard Grey and instead took the politician's identity. I think Richard Grey might actually just be insane. Now, between roughly 1950 and 1970, 90% of superhero origin stories involved either chemicals or radiation. That's just kind of how it worked. The Flash we are all most familiar with, Barry Allen, became the fastest man alive when he was working at his forensic laboratory one night. A bolt of lightning struck his rack of chemicals and also Barry himself. In a stroke of luck, instead of completely frying the guy, the electricity from the lightning mixed with the unique and specific collection of chemicals, and it gave Barry Allen super speed and access to the Speed Force. While that may give you some pause, it's a classic origin story and most of us have just come to accept it now. 3 years after the Flash debuted, Barry Allen was visited by Wally West, the nephew of Barry's girlfriend, Iris West. Wally was a big fan of the Flash, so Barry took him on a tour of his lab, the very lab where he was struck by lightning and gained his powers. Well, what do you know? A rogue bolt of lightning struck the very same rack of chemicals, all of which were still stored alongside each other, and then the lightning struck Wally West. The electricity mixed with this apparent unique collection of chemicals, and can you guess what happened? Yeah, Wally West gained super speed and access to the Speed Force. It's not like it doesn't make sense for the same event to produce the same outcome, but I guess lightning really do be striking twice, I guess. Or we got lazy with the writing. I'll let you pick. But while you're deciding on that, did you ever just randomly, accidentally drink a formula for creating super plastic thinking that it was soda instead? Has that ever happened to you? No, it probably hasn't. And if it did, you'd probably need to be rushed to the hospital. That's because we live in the real world. But in DC Comics, all logic just goes out the window. So when Chuck Tain mistook a super plastic formula for soda pop and downed the whole thing down his gullet, instead of needing urgent medical attention, he instead gained the ability to inflate himself to a ridiculous degree and bounce around with enough speed and velocity to actually make him incredibly efficient in combat. Chuck went on to become a key member of the 30th century's Legion of Superheroes as Bouncing Boy, and I think I've said enough about him. Alan Scott was the first ever original Green Lantern, but while the other lanterns that we have come into contact with were test pilots, veteran soldiers, and comic book artists who were chosen to become members of an intergalactic corps of space cops, Alan Scott was a train engineer, saved from what would have been a fatal train accident by a magical green engineer's lantern made thousands of years ago in China out of a meteorite. But get this, the meteorite in question actually housed the spirit known as the Starheart that needed to fulfill a prophecy to bring death, life, and power. Apparently, the spirit had already at some point in the past brought death and life already, so when it came upon Alan Scott, it was time to bring power in the form of his unique magical power ring. The funny thing was that even when DC Comics created Hal Jordan and the Green Lantern Corps, Alan's origins remained exactly the same. Only change came when Jeff Johns made it so that the Starheart used to be an experiment that the Guardians of Oa were unable to contain. As it made its way to Earth in the form of a meteorite to one day save Alan Scott, it took some inspiration from the Green Lantern Corps, seemingly influencing Scott to take the Green Lantern name. But the weirdest thing about this whole origin is that Alan Scott's main weakness is wood. What's up with that? I don't know. But from one strange lantern to another, the son of a poor farmer, Daniel Cormack was raised in Ireland. Like most Irish people, he came into contact with the Seed. They're basically an Irish fairy people, some of whom he managed to become really good pals with. Now it turns out that the fairies actually really liked Daniel because Maeve, the fairy queen, granted him a magical lantern as repayment for his friendship to the fairy people. The power of this lantern is interesting. It slowly waxes until its peak at midnight and then slowly wanes after until it is at its weakest at noon. Now with his lantern, Jack is able to fly, teleport himself or others, generate blasts of energy, create illusions, generate fog, change the size of enemies and bind them inside the lantern, and he can also become superhumanly strong and durable. That's a great set of powers. Now using the lantern, he took up the identity of Jacko Lantern and became Ireland's premier superhero, eventually joining the Global Guardians, even getting 2 successors in the form of Marvin Noronsa and eventually Liam McHugh. Now coming up in our third to last spot today, a lot of comic book superhero origins have to do with some kind of accident. A freak lightning bolt, an interrupted gamma explosion, an alien plane crash, it's just how it goes. But for professional saxophone blower Johnny Domino, aka the Nightman, his mysterious abilities to hear evil thoughts, see at night, no longer require sleep, psychically control a length of rope, and produce lightning through a connection to Celtic magic, all came about when he was just driving his Miata through the San Francisco Bay Area and an out-of-control streetcar, which got hit by magic lightning, crashed into him. Johnny Domino ended up in a coma for several weeks, and when he finally came back to, boom, powers. Not a bad deal until you learn that the big old downside to all of his powers is that he is now a cannibal. Nightman needs to literally consume a broth consisting of a handful of human organs every couple of months in order for him to stay alive. Reading that made me nauseous. Also, the Nightman even had his own short-lived TV show, and if you haven't seen the intro for that show, trust me, you gotta check it out. And in for our runner-up spot today, when Ralph Dibny of DC Comics was a tiny little Ralph Dibny, he saw a contortionist at a carnival and he was instantly down to be just like that guy. Everyone has their thing, and for Ralph, his thing was trying to figure out how someone could twist and fold their body into all sorts of shapes like that guy could. Obsessed with learning the secrets of the contortionists, for years and years, Ralph figured out that all the contortionists he observed drank the same drink. Not some crazy formula, not some kind of tea, but it was actually a popular soft drink known as Gingle. Now, Ralph knew for the most part that it was just a coincidence that they all drank the same drink, but that doesn't mean he wasn't gonna bet everything he had on it. Ralph ended up literally teaching himself chemistry, which should be the superpower here, and then he used these newly found chemistry abilities to create a super concentrated extract from the fruit that was the basis and heart for the Gingle drink, the Gingo fruit. What do you know? The super concentrated extract allowed him to make any part of his body stretch to ridiculous degrees. What's that, I hear you say? Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. You're right. But finally, coming in at our #1 spot today, The Flaming Carrot has been published by different publishers all over the place, so I'd forgive you for not knowing who he is. From Aardvark, Vanaheim, Renegade Press, and Dark Horse Comics until 2005, when he began being published by Image Comics. Other reason that you may not know who he is because look at him. He's utterly ridiculous. His utterly ridiculous look is matched by his equally ridiculous origin story. Essentially, the Flaming Carrot became a superhero after deciding to read 5,000 comic books in a row. Curiously, for him, reading that many comics caused the unknown man to get brain damage. He then donned a giant carrot for a mask, which was topped with an eternal flame, and he became a crime fighter. His gear and equipment is pretty equally nuts. He has a utility belt which carries a yo-yo, Lucky Rabbit's foot, laughing gas, a magnifying glass, band-aids with little stars and rockets on them, silly putty, a skeleton key, stink bombs, a decoder badge, Pez candy, a magnet, a bubble pipe, super glue, a wishbone, training cards, invisible ink, sneeze powder, and fizzies. That's his gear, alongside a nuclear-powered pogo stick, which is in his mask, and flippers that he wears at all times, just in case he has to swim. And that is all she wrote. Thank you guys so much for watching here on Top 10 Nerd. I'm your host, Adam Andrews. I'll catch you all on the flippy flop, but until then, peace out, nerds.